Hello, I'm Claire Poole and welcome to the Climate of Sport podcast, the show in which you get the inside track on all things sport and sustainability globally. Join me every week where I'll be chatting to a special guest about news, opinion and insights on how sport is moving to a more environmentally friendly future or taking action on climate change. Hi everyone and welcome to this week's episode of the Climate of Sport podcast. It is my pleasure to be back with you again, and this week joined by Melissa Wilson, former GB rower and now co-founder of Athletes of the World. Welcome Melissa to the podcast.
Hello Claire, it's lovely to be here.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you. So let's start at the beginning in terms of if there's people who are listening who aren't aware of you and your work and what you've been up to in the last few years. Could you start by giving us a bit of a background on you?
Yeah, absolutely. So my journey, I think, was a kind of tale of two halves that only in the last couple of years ended up amalgamating into what I'm doing now. So as you mentioned, I was a GB rower and I learnt to row at uni and kind of progressed through under 23s and then was in the senior team for 4 or 5 years training for the Tokyo Games. And during that time, I was, I think, increasingly aware of being out in the natural environment and also couldn't really shield myself from more and more news articles about climate change and what was happening. And it meant that in my kind of work life and what I was studying, I'd started doing an English degree and then developed an interest in law, and partway through my law course ended up in a conversation with someone who said, well, actually, you know, we use law all the time to solve environmental issues, and so you might want to think about that. So I was kind of busily completing my training 3 times a day and prepping for the games, but also outside my sport, looking at how I developed an environmental law practice. And my plan was to start that in kind of autumn 2020 after the games had finished. So in March 2020, I was selected for the Olympic team, and 3 days later, I think the games were postponed, and that felt like a real spanner in the works, because I'd loved the rowing, and I felt like in terms of what I'd given to the sport, I was probably running out of beans a bit, and was also really looking forward to turning my attention to this issue that I really cared about the environment. And so it really felt like it was going to be a hard mental shift to just postpone everything and turn things around. And so what was really helpful was that actually during that kind of March, April period in 2020, I started for the first time really having conversations that were around sport and sustainability and the power of sport in this space. And I really feel like since then it's been on a massive learning curve, and it seemed bizarre to me at times that I spent so long training as an athlete without realizing that that there was all this work going on. But also I think a lot has picked up in this last few years, and so now, as you said, my work is kind of revolved around sport and sustainability, and especially the role that athletes can play in all of this.
Yeah, definitely. And isn't that, it's incredible, just on a couple of levels. One, you know, considering the impact you've had, which we'll get on to talking about in just a couple of short years in terms of that, which is incredible. But also that had COVID not have happened and the games had happened, etc., you know, the path could have been so different, if that's, you know, in terms of the timing of that for you.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. And my brother, we were talking this weekend actually about how you size up to challenges and how big a challenge you seek to size up to. We were kind of, I'm as a rower, I remember being captivated by this idea that surfers always look for the biggest wave, and you go out looking for the thing that kind of scares you most, or that you have to really try hard to conquer. But I was saying to my father James, I'm just not sure. Like, there's part of me that would like to just dabble around in the shallows sometimes and not. Yeah, I mean, where do we sit with this? And also the when you size up to a really big challenge, there's always that edge of, well, what if you fail? And then he was very helpful, because he just kind of stayed silent and let me roll through my thoughts. And the bit I got to was, well, actually, I mean, yeah, I tried to go to an Olympics. The kind of end of that story is the following year I suffered a lot of injuries, and so didn't end up competing. And so in that conversation, I got to a place of thinking, actually, it's not that kind of cheesy, everything happens for a reason, but it is slightly the kind of, okay, I went really hard after one goal, and right at the last minute, my path was diverted, but it now feels like I'm in the right place. And he said, yeah, I mean, I didn't want to say, well, you didn't go to the Olympics, but yeah, glad you got there, Melissa. And so, yeah, you're right. It can be a bit weird how some things work out.
Yeah, and for the best of it, and I think, I'm sure in terms of athletes, ahead of the games, I'm sure there was loads that fell into a similar situation as you, in terms of, that delay really had an impact, in terms of people's trajectories and stuff, and the way they'd geared up and how that worked out. But yeah, I am a bit of a fatalist in that sense, in terms of, it might be a bit cheesy, but things do happen for a reason, or you don't know it at the time. You could be focusing on something that feels very negative, but actually something very positive is coming, which is great. And that's what we've seen, obviously, from your work in the last couple of years, in terms of what you've achieved already. And it'd be great for those who don't know. I remember very clearly, sort of, it's the first time I found out about you was a mutual friend of ours, Ed, who said to me, do you know Melissa Wilson? And I was like, no, I don't think so. So this was probably a couple of years ago. And he was like, oh my God, she's incredible. And I was like, what's going on? And he said, she's only got 250 Olympia or 300 Olympians to sign a letter to Boris Johnson about the green recovery. And I was like, what? This is incredible. Because as someone who'd been in the space for longer, and we're talking to athletes all the time and trying to get athletes to talk out more and be more visible. And, historically, it's been quite difficult to get that visibility. And then in lands Melissa, and there's hundreds of them sign a letter about, the green recovery after COVID to the Prime Minister and delivering that. So for those who don't know, tell us the story behind that, and correct me on the numbers as well, in terms of how many there were.
No, you're pretty spot on. Well, I think the first thing it's important to say is it was absolutely a team effort. So at that point, I was part of an organisation, Champions for Earth, which is set up by Olympic champion Etienne Stott and an ex-GB rower, Dave Hampton. And they were the first ones to really help me tune into all of the overlaps that there were between a lot of the vocabulary and approach that we use in sport and how we would ideally be approaching climate issues. And so I was having those conversations, but also doing a piece of work for an organisation called the Good Law Project. And it was about kind of legal mechanisms for helping face the climate situation we're in. And I was writing a kind of introductory chapter to a short paper, and one of the pieces was like, what's the context, what's the circumstances we're in? And the more I was writing about the fact that we were in this pandemic and the opportunity that these circumstances, these difficult circumstances, provided for a green recovery, the more I thought, actually, this is a pretty apolitical thing that people could be getting behind. And actually, I think a lot of athletes would get behind this. And so I started chatting to the team at Champions for Earth, and we decided to write up a letter. And the content of the letter was very much trying to tap into some of the core qualities of sport, and saying, really, as a country, as the UK, we're really excellent, firstly, at prioritising legacy when it comes to big events like the Olympics. And the letter starts by saying, look, if it hadn't been for the pandemic, we'd all be at an Olympics or watching an Olympics. We'd be inspired by all that athletes are doing here, and we're not. But what opportunities like the Olympics show us are, firstly, that the UK is great at prioritising legacy. And we saw that with London most of all, the 2012 games, when it was all about passing on a legacy to future generations. And then what we're also really good at is wanting to win and wanting to be at the front of the pack, and Team GB really like wanting to get as high up on that medals table as possible. And what the letter was saying was those things where they could really come into play is in terms of climate, because at that point we had the COP26 summit coming on the horizon, and we also had the G7 presidency as well. And so this letter was saying, look, in prioritising a green recovery, we're not really doing anything differently. We're just channeling what we channel in a sporting context into the context where it actually matters, because really a sporting legacy only goes so far, and for that to really flourish, we need a healthy and safe planet for future generations to thrive in. And so we wrote this letter, and really just started by sending it out to a few friends and athletes that we knew, and so there were quite a lot of rowers at first in the list of signatories, and then one in particular, my friend Constantine, who's in the men's four in Rio 2016, said, hey Melissa, this is great, and can I pass it on to the GB Olympians Association? And that's really when the ball started rolling. And so we hadn't been very organised. We hadn't got a kind of formal sign up. So people were just emailing my inbox, and as you say, we ended up, I think, with 320 GB Olympians and Paralympians, and most of them just signed up of their own accord. Some of them we got in touch with agents, and it was quite interesting to see that occasionally you kind of you could contact someone kind of 5 or 6 times, and it would maybe just take that bit of perseverance, so that when you're able to say, okay, well, we've now got 200 signatories, or we've now got 250, we've now got 300, I think that kind of taught me something about tipping points, I guess, and the power behind bringing people together to do something. But I think that the majority of athletes, what was valuable about our disorganisation and the fact that people were contacting me directly, was that it gave me a kind of front row seat for how people were really feeling about this issue. And I think that really fed into what I'm doing now, because it was really powerful to receive emails from, we had over 40 Olympic and Paralympic champions sign it, and then all those other, many other medalists and many other medalists or non-medalists who've gone on to do amazing things in their lives. They're very motivated, inspiring individuals, and for them to be saying, look, I was so focused on my performance as an athlete over my time in sport, and now really the only thing I care about is having a future for my children or my grandchildren or whatever. I think that really helped confirm for me that there was something here in what we were doing, and that there were actually a lot of athletes that were willing to engage in this space. They just maybe hadn't found the mechanism that was a good fit for them.
Absolutely. And that, I think the impact of that letter was massive, just in terms of almost seeing athletes in a different light around these issues as well, because I think we'd had individual athletes maybe talking out, being a little bit more vocal, etc., but it all felt quite individual, I think, up to that point. There was obviously sort of groups in place that were supporting athletes, etc., and there was things happening in a community basis. But I think, to my knowledge anyway, at that time, it's the first time athletes had come together at that scale to talk about something around climate change, and that, talk about tipping points. I think that really has helped to move the athlete conversation forward in terms of the role that athletes can play, and this idea of collective action that athletes can help drive awareness around. I think, I don't know if you'd seen anything else before that, but I don't, not at that scale for sure, in terms of athletes coming together to talk about climate.
No, I'm not sure I had. And I think it's a really interesting piece around, it's something I still haven't really worked out yet, whether the power of messengers is kind of undoubted here, but I don't really know yet whether, I think there's something about an individual standing up and having the strength of conviction that they will say alone that something really matters. But I think perhaps particularly with an issue like climate, which affects all of us over the entire earth and really needs all of us, it just makes sense to me that we would be bringing athletes together rather than doing a kind of laser focus trying to get individuals to stand alone on this, because that's not really what we need, I think.
No, absolutely. And I think there's different perspectives on it, isn't there? So there's the idea that athletes as individuals, it's great for them to come to the party, if you like, on this in a way that feels authentic to them. So if it's not about climate change as a whole, it might be about, like Hannah, reducing single-use plastic, or it might be like athletes that want to talk more about veganism and plant-based, etc. So it's good for athletes to come at it in a way that feels authentic and credible to themselves. But I think you're right. I think there's that individual awareness in that way is really helpful. But when it comes to driving wider change, that unity and the larger group of collective action has to have more impact, does it, in terms of the fact that just literally by the scale of it and the ambition and the joined up messaging and the sort of unity around that, you would presume that that has to have more of an impact than one or two individuals, even if they're talking about it from a very big platform.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that it's a direction that sport as a whole is taking more, certainly in kind of, really, I guess my territory is UK sport and the culture within that. But I do think that it's definitely that idea of what are the long wins, what is the collective benefit of what's happening here, rather than the individual moments can still be some of the most impactful, the most inspiring, and some of the things I will think back to kind of Mo Farah's arms held aloft or whatever, and that absolutely a lot of people can come together around a single individual. But I think it did feel like what was a little bit untapped was this idea that actually athletes, I think when Hannah and I, as part of Athletes of the World, are working with athletes now, athletes, I think, can be used to feeling like the spotlight is just on them, and not necessarily in a positive way. As an athlete myself, I definitely felt like it was your job to do everything right to make sure that your performance was best. Even if you were part of a team, your job was to make your part of the boat move as fast as it possibly can. So you're used to kind of micromanaging all of your life so that it delivers the best of you. And that is a really positive thing. But I think in terms of when you try to translate that into climate advocacy, that can set a bar very high for kind of initial engagement. And I think one of the things that we as part of Athletes of the World are trying to do is communicate that actually it's not about perfection. Athletes know that perfection in sport isn't possible, but perfection with climate really isn't possible. And I think we hold ourselves back in a kind of practical sense. Some people, I think, do far less than they could because of the sense of, well, there's too much to do, and where would I even start? But also in an advocacy sense, it's kind of like, well, unless I know everything about this issue, why would I speak about it? Rather than saying, well, we may not be experts in a technical sense, but we have expertise in that. Firstly, we're humans living on this planet and have a real vested interest in the direction this is going. And secondly, the expertise that I think athletes do have is around the qualities, and kind of touched on this idea that athletes and sport is the arena in which we most readily confront ideas about legacy and leadership and ambition and resilience and collaboration. And so I think my piece is trying more to work out how we tap into and unlock that, rather than saying to athletes, you will need to be perfectionists on everything that we're doing. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that's massive. A few years ago, Jolie, who's obviously involved with the Commonwealth Games now, is actually on a previous podcast as well. She and I together wrote a piece for Matthews Campelli's The Sustainability Report about that, about sort of the parallel between an athlete's training journey to a goal and what we needed to do with climate change. And it is like, compared to other people in the public eye or whatever, athletes are the best equipped to deal with the massive challenge in terms of that parallel. You think of other people in the public eye who garner the same amount of awareness, or people look up to as role models, etc., in different areas of entertainment, arts, culture, etc., in very, very different ways. There's the similar qualities, but athletes, in terms of setting a goal and a challenge, in culture and arts, people have that same mentality, but somehow with sports, it feels more gritty to get, really tackle that challenge. And there is such a massive parallel there. And just to add on as well, I think the big, we want to hear more about Athletes of the World and where you're at with that, as well as some of the other work that you're doing around the video at COP26 and the rugby players, etc., and other initiatives you've done after that initial letter. But just before I forget, one thing stuck in my mind as well when you were talking was just that in terms of the role of athletes as part of this. Whenever I'm chatting to media and we're trying to get more and more mainstream media coverage of sport, what's happening in sport and sustainability or sport and climate action, if they can get athletes to talk about these issues, it's so much easier for them to get that story into the press, onto the TV, etc., because sport broadcast, sport media coverage is, it's about the business of sport, but mainly it's about athletes and performance and that side. So again, that role in terms of, as you said, not being perfectionist, being credible, etc., but also being open to be that spokesperson as well. And that, I think, is a major cut-through point where we can take the coverage, continue to make sport and climate more mainstream, and then more people will know about it, more people will take action. And I think as much as we as industry leaders can try and drive that behind the scenes as much as possible, really, in sports press, they want to hear from athletes or managers or people who are at the forefront of performance.
Yes. And I think in some ways, when we drill right down to the most powerful things that athletes can be saying, some of it can be about raising awareness. But I think a lot of people have quite a high degree of awareness now of the problem, but in terms of the desire to engage with it, that can remain sometimes quite low. And it doesn't seem at all surprising, because I think any of us who turn our sight towards this problem, this climate crisis that we're facing, I don't know about you, I find it really easy to want to just shut my eyes, turn back around and think I'm just going to block that out and try to enjoy the time where stuff is working and everything seems okay. And I think I just over the last few years have recognised more and more how helpful it was to me to have those years where I'd be facing things that really scared me, performances that I knew I had to kind of succeed in, physical pain as something that is really can provoke a lot of kind of very base level fear and discomfort, and having to get good at pushing through that and being and kind of trying to thrive or come out of that in the best place. And I think one of the things that athletes can try to model is the capacity to turn towards things that scare us, particularly when done collectively. I think that is really where the most powerful messaging lies, because if we as a society felt in a better position to really turn towards what scares us, then I think we'd be tapping into some of the most remarkable human qualities. And that is where I think we'd then have a lot of capacity to then really progress in this space.
Yeah, definitely. So tell us as well, just to finish off. So since the original letter, you've brought together around COP, the video at COP.
Yes. So I guess off the back of the Green Recovery letter, I then thought, right, there's obviously a lot more going on in this space. There are brilliant people like Claire Poole at Sport Positive and Matthew, and there's I don't know, I feel like there's 20, 30, 40 groups just in the UK that are doing work in this space. And I wanted to make sure that if I was trying to work in a similar area, that I wasn't going to be duplicating effort or whatever. So there's a bit of time spent just trying to map out what was going on, which I feel is just a constantly unfurling picture in a really exciting way. And then started having some conversations with Team GB in the run up to the Tokyo Games, and that definitely felt like one of these life not panning out the way you want, but potentially just as rewarding and exciting an opportunity. So even though by that point I was too injured to be competing in the games, by working with Team GB, and we developed some athlete education with an organisation, Aim High Earth, and we delivered that to Team GB athletes before they went out to the games. We were also having conversations about how we actually reduce the footprint of competing in the games and look at that in a kind of longer term sense. But it did feel like that offered a way of engaging with the Olympics in a really positive way, where otherwise I might have thought, oh, right.
I'm not there. Boo.
That was a lot of pain. And now I'm not in Tokyo. And then in the aftermath of that, really, I think what I've been trying to do all the time is work out what the hurdles are that need to be overcome in order for athletes to do more in this space and be better equipped to do so. But one of the things that one of the really positive things that happened in 2021 was starting to get to know Hannah Mills better, double Olympic champion sailor. And somewhere along the way, I think quite early on, we thought actually we're very similarly minded in terms of how we want to approach this issue. And we decided that we'd post-Tokyo work together, and we founded this organisation, Athletes of the World. And I think we had our first in-person meeting in the September. We were in a coffee shop in a pool, and we were kind of trying to map out how the following 12 months might look. And the where we thought was easiest was just mapping out big events that were happening and saying, right, well, what should we do about this? And so we said, right, well, first event is COP26. It's, I guess, in 2 months. And we were throwing some ideas around, and one of us said, well, look, why don't we try to create a video? Sorry for the
in London. This is not London, Scotland.
Okay. Well, we can reimagine this coffee shop in pool. We said, yeah, let's create this video with athletes from the Olympic Games talking directly to world leaders, and we were very lucky that the IOC came on board with it and said, yeah, we'll support you, we'll help create it. And so we ended up with over 50 Olympians from Tokyo and Paralympians, 35 flag bearers, athletes like Andy Murray and Eliud Kipchoge and Tom Daley, saying to world leaders, look, this is COP26 is like the Olympics of climate summits. This is the race we need to win, and you're the people to do it. And we as athletes are right behind you in you being ambitious and brave in the policies you come out with. And so we had that, and then I think 2 weeks later we had this letter to World Rugby where a couple of rugby sevens players had started chatting to me about what was going on in their sport, and they said, well, look, I just think we would really value our national governing bodies and our federation knowing how much strength of support there is within the rugby playing body from athletes. And so that letter, all of these are riffing on the same themes, but that letter said, look, this is a sport of ambition and camaraderie and leadership and bravery, and some of our core rugby playing nations like Fiji and Tonga and Samoa are some of the communities most under threat as a result of climate change. So as athletes, as the rugby sporting body, we really want to come together and make sure that we're doing everything that we can. And so we've had, I guess, probably 3 campaign-based initiatives over the last 18 months or so. And then what we're doing at the moment is working with the Commonwealth Games with Joey Lee and her team, looking at how we can support the athlete engagement there over the summer with athlete climate education and also some kind of behaviour change exploration as well, which could be quite fun. So
amazing! There's so much going on. I think that you say the same themes, but in terms of but in such different ways, in such different communities and areas of sport and stuff, and to get that messaging out, because it always strikes me in terms of sport, and even having worked in this area for so long, that actually, especially with athletes and with sports, people are very siloed in their own area. So whilst you've done something massive with GB Olympians, etc., you know, the rugby community, although they may have been aware of that parenthetically, they haven't really got involved with that directly. And I think that is really important, actually, for us to think about in terms of athletes, in terms of athlete communities. What's the feedback to some of the work that you're doing around that behaviour change or education piece on climate change?
Yeah, I think it definitely, whether you're working with athletes or not, it can be really tricky to get it exactly right. And I think so often we'll end up being somewhere in the middle. As you were talking, I was thinking what you were saying just made me feel more than ever that it's so important that as many people as possible come into this space and contribute in their skills and their community in whatever way they can, because I think we're all perpetually facing a kind of knockoff choice to be made between, do we go big in terms of, do we try to just work at a kind of Olympic scale or Premier League scale with sheer numbers, or do you dive down into some of the places where community and solidarity are actually felt most strongly, which can be more grassroots, in order to do that and do it well, really you need a whole network of people who are able to, or individuals right across all these different communities. I think when we're getting feedback from the athlete education sessions and the behaviour, so this pilot that we're doing with Commonwealth Games was going to be really interesting, because it's looking at how we best accommodate the needs of an athlete lifestyle. Especially we'll be doing it probably in June, so it's in the run up to the games themselves, and that's not the easiest time to catch an athlete and say, would you mind doing X, Y, and Z to slightly to adjust your carbon footprint? But I think it will be really interesting to see how it unfolds. What does interest me as well is, we were talking to an athlete recently, and I won't specify the sport, but they were saying, well, people on my team struggle to focus for a 20-minute team debrief just about their sport. So you need to keep that in mind if you're going to sit them down and try to talk to them about climate. And so there's a kind of that has certainly stuck in my mind, and I think will inform how we're doing this. And I think what is sometimes a little bit overwhelming, but also I guess quite a fun creative opportunity, is working out how you remodel and reformat so that you create the best resources for individuals across different sports, so that if somebody needs something that's just a 2-minute long video or a 1-minute long Instagram piece or shorter, we do that, or someone does that, but we also have the opportunity for the more in-depth, because I think I guess my experience would be, well, if you're going to get me to speak about something, then even if I don't remember everything that you say to me in an hour, I would like at least an hour talking about some of these issues and kind of unpacking them a bit and understanding how I should be approaching it. So I think some of it is about a sport-specific approach, but a lot of it I think is just accommodating for the variety of individuals that you get and what might suit what might suit different people. But I think the broad brush learnings, and not really from what we've been doing, but I guess how we've been doing what we've been doing has been informed by our own time as athletes. And what's really helpful about working with Hannah is that I think we're able to remind each other that we've got to make this easier to do, or we've got to make this journey smoother, because if they, like we were, have just completed their 3rd session of a day, they are not in the headspace to sit down for something in one format. It's going to need to be in a different format. So it's just kind of...
And I think that's an incredible takeaway as well for people listening to this, because I think we talk about athlete and fan engagement a lot in terms of this effort. And I think, a lot of people, we think about it, but it's always good to be reminded and think about it more specifically as well, that whatever we do in terms of engagement and communications on climate change or education, there's no one size fits all for everyone, whether it's an athlete or a fan, because we actually talk about it more with fan engagement, don't we, in the Britain Talks Climate stuff, which is incredible, and kind of breaking, societies at large are made up of so many different people with political affiliations, cultural backgrounds, different experiences, etc. And there's a lot of work there in the community and the sort of citizen space about we can't engage with people in the same way on the same issues because it's not going to land, because we're all so different and fall in different spectrums in so many different ways. But it's exactly the same for athletes. As you said, some of those athletes are going to be at the very start of their career and, perhaps gross generalization, are entirely focused on that and only that. Others will be further towards the end of their career and they're starting to think about what's next, and they might have more time for that. Or certain sports, they've not come through a way where they're used to having long briefings all the time. And as you said, that's difficult enough. So that, I think, is a really good takeaway from this in terms of reminding ourselves of that through our work.
Yes. And actually, in some ways, the kind of athlete that I've painting of having done 3 sessions a day, day in, day out, and they're not that person who is totally exhausted and has pushed everything that they felt they had into just getting through their sessions and getting to the end of the day in physically a better place than they were at the beginning. I think that's quite a useful metaphor for where campaigners need to meet a lot of people, whether they're training as elite athletes or not, because whether people are parents or caring for parents or have a full-time job or are struggling with their energy bills or whatever. I mean, our world is a complicated one, and I think sometimes it doesn't help when there's a kind of division between people who are submerged in this day in, day out, and get the community feel of, oh, well, I'm with like-minded people who are also dealing with this issue, and so let's all just use our bamboo toothbrushes and let's all just shop locally, and it's fine. And if we try to take that without recognizing, look, I may well be meeting someone who feels like they are just holding water. How do we I think it's our job as campaigners in this space to try to make the path as smooth as possible, remove hurdles, so that people feel like, okay, actually it's manageable. And sometimes I think it kind of reminded me as well, is this quote I really like that I'm going to butcher from this previous American judge on the Supreme Court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who said something like, if you're going to have an argument with someone, make sure you use the words that they can understand.
Yeah.
And I think it can be so easy. We've talked about the scale of the problem and how intimidating it can be. And if you're choosing to turn towards that and look at the size of the wave, it can be easy to feel like turning immediately back and yelling at the next person you see, like, right, we need to do this, we need to do it this way, we need to, and actually are trying to keep both in mind and see the scale of the problem and the need for urgency, but also communicate it in a way that you're actually bringing people on board rather than pushing them away, I think is a big challenge.
Yeah. In terms of that communication going out there, that's the role that athletes can help with. That is so massive in terms of that, it can't be understated. And I think, from just to pull up on another point you mentioned as well, of the professional versus the grassroots sort of side, I think, and Tom Gribben, who came on a previous podcast, mentioned it as well in terms of their learnings with Planet Super League, and that when they got, some top flight footballers to do outreach, the visibility was brilliant. And that was wonderful to have that, what you would call an air campaign to raise awareness of the overall issue. But when it came to the ground campaign for them of getting families, schools, etc., signing up to their campaign and doing the activity, it was a teacher in a school or a coach in a community that drove more sign-ups than, a top flight football player. And there's definitely, to your point, something in that in terms of we need again, I think it's a credibility, it's a visibility, it's a getting this more mainstream. We need those athletes to get that messaging out there. But when it comes to actually getting people to make changes in their own lives, there's definitely a connect from that level down to a community level to then drive that action. And I don't think we're anywhere near cracking the nut on that, to be honest. And I have this conversation a lot with a few people who ask me a lot, why don't you do more on community and grass sport? I can't get my words out. Why don't you do more on that? And honestly, the absolutely simple answer is it's much more difficult to get across grassroots sports in terms of the scale of it, who's in charge of it, what's happening, etc. It's a lot easier to get your arms around professional sports because obviously it's better resourced. Obviously there's more people working in it. And now we're starting to see people who've got a sustainability part of their role. So you can access those people and help drive that work. And there's so much to do. Again, to the point of human beings taking the path of least resistance, when there's so much to do, you go for the easiest stuff first. So professional sport is an easier in than going through to every community at a grassroots level. But we need that to filter down now more than ever, because we're starting to see from empirical evidence that behaviour change is going to happen through those community groups, not through that air campaign of super high profile athletes saying really important things, which still has to happen. I can't underline that enough, but there's just that disconnect that I don't know what you think, but I don't think we're anywhere near cracking that yet.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. In some ways, I guess it feels like if you're already overwhelmed about the scale of the climate problem, then it's quite difficult to also get in to bear in mind the scale of all the grassroots organisations and work out how you engage with all of those. And I think for people listening, first, if you're part of grassroots sports, I think we just need more people to be involved in this. And I think specifically with our focus with athletes, what has really surprised me in a positive way is how easy it is to feel as an athlete quite siloed into your sport, and also the hierarchy of, okay, are you somebody who's competed at under 23s, or are you someone who's competed at senior world championships? Did you make a senior A final? Were you did you get a medal? When it comes to an issue like this, I think a lot of hierarchies can be removed. And I've been surprised, as somebody who during my time as a professional athlete would not have thought about getting in touch with some of the people that we now do. There's a real sense of, wherever you've sat within that community, I think because you've had shared experiences and have a shared understanding, you can communicate that bit more easily than somebody who hasn't. And it doesn't matter, you don't actually have to. I think previously I'd have thought, oh, maybe if I get a few gold medals, then I'll be able to contact somebody about an issue I care about. And I just don't think that's the case. So if there are athletes, whether you're at grassroots or not, I think it's quite an interesting exercise just to sit down with a pad of paper and think of some people who you would like to get in touch with and say, okay, who are the people that I would need to get in touch with in order to contact that person? And I think we can all do that. That applies kind of in sport or out of sport. But when you were talking about the direction of travel and the kind of how we need to shift, I think it surprised me how much that can go both ways. And wherever you sit within sport, I think part of one of the wonderful things that sport creates is this feeling of community and being part of a team. And I think that actually exists to a far greater extent than I thought it did whilst I was training professionally.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, there's so much here, but tell me, for you, I know there's for any of us, there's no end point to this in terms of us having cracked it, and we can all, go home and not worry about it anymore, because there's just not going to happen. But
yeah, we are home. It's not, but
well, metaphorically, pack up our bags and go home because the job is done. But what, so it's not like what success looks like, but what is your hope for the future in terms of the work that you're doing? And maybe it's in 10 years time, or maybe it's just gradually what your hope is for the future in terms of how things are going to progress based on the work that you're doing.
Yes. I I think there are kind of two routes. So there's one which would be great is if we're in 10 years' time, there is just a lot more of this. So at the moment, it feels like there are a few athlete-focused groups, but there aren't many athlete-led groups. And there aren't, I could probably count on maybe 5 or 6 hands how many athletes there are who actually feel like they can engage with this on a regular basis and use the platform that they have and feel confident in doing so. And what we really need is that to be hundreds or thousands, or just the norm within sports teams and clubs and organizations. And that's just part of being an athlete and part of being a human. And it's not about us all reaching for our soapbox but it's having those conversations. It can be having an interview or talking to a sponsor, but it could also be just talking to the people in your own immediate community. And I think when we're talking about the grassroots piece, I think the scale of that sort of action probably will only happen through a lot of people feeling like they can be leaders in their own way of living and their own way of being. So I guess that's one option. And then the second maybe is as a result of that. There's an Australian organisation, Front Runners, led by Emma Pocock and her husband David, ex-rugby player. And Emma says, well, look, our ambition is that in a few years' time, we won't need to exist, because if we do our job right, they're also focused on how do we empower athletes in this space. And I think what the ideal would be is if it is just so the norm. At the moment, it feels like we're still having quite a lot of conversations with national governing bodies or federations or clubs or athletes themselves to say, look, athletes are so powerful in this space. They've got so much potential. It just needs to be facilitated. Yeah. And I think it would be great if, I don't imagine that's a conversation. If we do our work right, I would really hope that that's not a conversation that we have to have in perpetuity, because I think it just needs for sport to grow outwards a bit to understand the real concrete impact that it can have on an issue that impacts itself and the future of sport, but also impacts every living being on this earth. So I think that's where redundancy would be
scale and redundancy are the outcomes that you're looking for. I love it. Well, that's it. If we could all do ourselves out of a job because sport's got this completely on lock, that is a wonderful legacy.
Because there are always other problems to I think.
It's hopeful that we'll be in that situation in our lifetime, but that's the whole point. That's what we aim for. That's the goal, and we'll keep plugging away at it. Well, it's been so lovely to chat to you and hear more about you and the story and what you're doing, and can't wait to see more from yourself and Hannah and Athletes of the World. And the Commonwealth Games and all the other great stuff you've got going on. So thank you very much for joining us today. And that was Melissa Wilson, former GB rower, now co-founder of Athletes of the World. Thanks for listening to the Climate of Sport podcast. Please like and subscribe, and get in touch if you want to share information about the work that you're doing, if you want to appear as a guest, or you want to recommend guests, or you just have ideas of conversations you'd like us to have. You can get in touch by emailing info@sportpositivesummit.com.